everybody, and I'm happy to call you back to order and introduce tonight's guest. Tonight's speaker is one of the most significant figures in Canadian publishing in the past 40 years. The creation of a publishing house in Vancouver around 1970 was no exceptional event. Everybody was starting a publishing house. What was exceptional was the development of one of them, Douglas McIntyre, into a world-class publishing house based in Vancouver with a branch office in Toronto. Scott McIntyre was born and raised in Vancouver, and following graduation from UBC, he had the good fortune in 1967 to join the firm of McClelland and Stewart Publishers in Toronto. In early 1970, he returned to Vancouver to work with Jim Douglas and co-found what became Douglas McIntyre. D&M developed into the most important publishing house in Western Canada. Scott has many appointments to foundations and councils. They are too numerous to mention. If you go on our website, you may find some of them. Among many other awards, he received an honorary degree from Simon Fraser University in 1996 and became a member of the Order of Canada in 1997. The books published by Douglas and McIntyre have been recognized for their design excellence on many, many occasions in the Alcuin Society's Design Awards competition. The clean and elegant style of D&M books remains in the memory of all who have the pleasure to use them. Beyond this beautiful style stands the content. Among other accomplishments, the house has made a fundamental contribution to the world's understanding of the environment and arts of British Columbia. Let me cite a few examples. The publication of Doris Shadbolt's The Art of Emily Carr in 1979 revealed to the world for the first time the full extent and excellence of Carr's work and raised her standing to that of an artist of world importance. Publications featuring Indigenous artists like Bill Reid and Robert Davison likewise revealed art of world importance that often eclipsed the most famous works of modern artists working in the Western tradition. The publication in 1999 of Robert Bringhurst's A Story as Sharp as a Knife, The Classical Haida Myth Makers and Their World, demonstrated how great and multifaceted the coastal culture is. The native people of BC acknowledge that their renaissance owes much to D&M. Substantial works featuring the natural landscape of British Columbia have had an important and lasting impact on the self-image of the province and have helped to form popular opinion in favor of environmental protection and in opposition to poor forestry, mining, transportation, and fishing practices. Since the work of Douglas and McIntyre is produced using ink on paper, it cannot be rewritten. It is permanent, unlike the ephemeral world of the digital. Well, as you might guess, I could go on, but like you, I want to hear from Scott. Please welcome Scott McIntyre to speak about learning to type, adventures in Canadian book publishing. Scott.
Well, listen,
that's very noisy. Thank you all. It seems to be a very good turnout. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Howard, for all those kind words. What I thought I would do, because first I should express my bias is that of a trade book publisher, which historically we were based in a region, although we never thought of ourselves that way. So there are academic presses, there are LI publishers, and all of that. So my biases reflect what we had hoped to achieve which was give shape and voice to the culture of this place. And from very early on, happy to say that our First Nations cultures struck a chord. Actually, my wife happened to study with Wilson Duff, which is one of the reasons that we discovered that path. But in all of this, when I looked back, I thought perhaps it would be interesting to hear stories, perhaps ideally funny, perhaps not, but more about the trials and tribulations of this crazy semi-business we are all in. So my talk tonight will be something of a meander, because when I went back to try to encapsulate 46 years in book publishing in roughly 30 minutes, the notes were all over the map. Of course, it's an impossible task. So I'm going to simply meander and single out some stories that I think illustrate some of the serendipities of book publishing and some of the joys of what 40 plus years in this business have meant. That having been said, my understanding is that the drill tonight is I'll talk for 20 to 30 minutes, and after that, depending on the appetite, there's time for 10, 20 minutes more of questions. I'm happy to do that. I prefer questions, and I can tell you that I'm not shy about being asked anything, so that I'm not going to talk particularly about the end game of what was D&M. If people have questions, they're free to ask them. But I'd rather talk about some of the things along the way that meant a great deal to me. And I got into this business, people would say, how did this happen? And it's easier to talk about the distant past, I think, perhaps. And it's again a combination of accidents. In grade 11 in high school, Lord Bain, there was a tap on the door of the class I was in one day, and a delegation of teachers said, would you like to edit the yearbook? Well, I can tell you that writing and publishing and the graphic arts, these were the furthest things from my mind. And because I passed, I was flattered. I said yes. It began there, and then it continued at UBC, where I edited the yearbook there for 2 years. And I think we did some rather interesting things. Met people like Alvin Balkan. I was on the Brock Art Committee. So I kind of got seduced by the world of print and of paper and type and all of that from a fairly early and naive and impressionable age. So that was the background. It was that straightforward. And actually, in university, met up with a photographer. Some of you may know, Robert Flick, with 2 B's. Went on to head the photography department at USC. He's now quite famous in the States. Had a monograph published by Steidl. Was our best man, ironically enough. But we decided we could do a book on Vancouver. And in our naivete, simply did that. It would have been awful. I was going to write it and design it. Robert did the photography, which has held up better than the other bits. But at the end of it, and part of this, we had a contract for, I think, a $50 advance from Howard Mitchell at Mitchell Press. But because Robert's lady was Jane Flick, who worked at Duffy, some of you would know her from the English department at UBC, she said, well, I know this guy, Jim Douglas, he's kind of the M&S rep here. You should meet him. And in those years, Jim was newly here. He was representing Macmillan and McClellan and Stewart and John Allen and others in a wholesale company on Seymour Street. In fact, that was the original J.J. Douglas Limited, which happens to have been incorporated on my birthday, May 13, 1964. I didn't know that then. And nothing ever changes. This had been set up by John Gray, Jack McClellan, and John Allen to try to preempt, where are the librarians? The librarians from buying around for international books. Because in those years, with the exception of McClellan, and I'm biased in favor of Jack McClellan. John Gray was a great publisher. Mark Jeanneret was a great publisher. But it was the flair and the flamboyance of M&S that attracted me. So when I was going to go to Toronto and was kind of intrigued at all of this, Jim described the 2 great strands in book publishing. All of this was new to me. and I was very young. There was the John Gray, the Macmillan, the book comes first, and then there was Jack McClellan, and probably Knopf and a few others. The author comes first. And of course, I didn't even want to meet John Gray, and I didn't. And Jim set up a meeting with Jack McClellan, which I have told this story before, so if it's boring, you will remind me that it is, and I should make it short. The first time I met Jack was here in 1966. I'm young, in a brown suit, short hair, terrified. This guy's a legend, and really was quite a guy. In the Bayshore, I knock on the door timidly. Jack opens it. He's in his underwear. And the first thing out of his first words out of his mouth, I swear to God, this is a true story, were, "Christ, I'm hungover." I liked him immediately. Ended up going back M&S. They said no to the book in Vancouver, but yes to me, and that's how I ended up at McClellan and Stewart in the summer of 1967. So it was an idealistic time. 1967, Canada, Expo, and of course in those years, everybody who was anybody trooped through McClellan and Stewart. So that from Peggy Atwood to Margaret Lawrence, to most of the politicians of the day, to Farley Mowat, who's still a friend, to Peter Newman, to Pierre Burt, they were all there. And that was pretty heady days for, in the case of my wife, who was not here because she got shingles for the last. But this for two kids from Vancouver who were in their early 20s. And I basically was handed the advertising and promotion department by the end of that year. So all of this fell in my lap, which was, to say, pretty unnerving and heady and crazy and scary and makes for good stories. So it started in '67, and really it went from there. And I'm not going to try to encapsulate all of McClellan and Stewart. And I'm going to keep an eye on time, by the way. But when I've been asked to say, what was McClellan and Stewart like? Because a bunch of us, it was Atwood and Mowat and Anna Porter and I, we all did a festschrift for Jack McClellan when he was going to be given an honorary degree by the University of Guadalajara in Pig, and Patsy Aldana was front and central in this. And we all trooped out off to the Guadalajara Book Fair. I can't remember what year this was. Was this in the 90s at some point, I guess? And there's a handsome publication, and Jack was going to get all of this. And that was the very week he was found at the bottom of a swimming pool in Florida. So he recovered, but he wasn't in Mexico. But it was kind of the sense of coming home for Jack. And I was very honored to be part of this. And it kind of grew in those directions. But in that, when I was asked to describe what McClellan and Stewart was like, and to try to sum it up, I said, well, you know, it's like being in the eye of a hurricane. It might seem calm, but you are surrounded by chaos. And that was true in those days. It was a pretty exciting time to be in Toronto, in Canada, encountering what was, I would argue, a kind of a renaissance. You know, this is the mid-'60s. It was the last great days of the book. This is the days when Knopf was still around, Forrest Strauss. I mean, this is when the great old publishing houses, most of them independent, most of them quite small. I mean, when Random House bought Knopf was smaller than we are, or we were. And so scale was utterly different. There weren't really agents. The explosion of books, to some extent following on the superstores, that this was all new. You know, Alfred Knopf would get on the 20th Century Limited to go to Chicago and sell all the bookstores personally. And that prevailed right into the 1970s, almost into the 80s. And then there was the Gulf and Western, Simon & Schuster. You know, there were the beginnings of the conglomerates. Big money. But that really changed. And I think now, in retrospect, I'm proud that I saw the last of the game as it was played by those of us who were book people. That's mostly over now, but it was It was a great time while it lasted. In fact, I've just finished reading Diana Athill's Stet, which is really her story. I knew her. What an amazing, clear mind she has. And tracing the rise and fall of Deutsch, and I don't want to compare publishing programs, but when I look at that kind of the inevitability of energy and scrambling and never enough money, and books come first, and then the gradual undermining as the multinationals start stealing everything away, and energy dissipates, and at the end of the day, Deutsch, after that sort of 20 or 30 years, Naipaul, Richler, most of the Mailer, much of the cream of American literature. There was a small independent house doing this, which was of about the same size as we were. But that kind of went away, and the guy who bought it, Tom Rosenthal, whom I'd known from Thames and Hudson, basically ran it into the ground because it just, publishing couldn't sustain or nourish that kind of energy and that kind of engagement, because the world had changed. And believe me, that was then, that was in the 80s. It has changed beyond imagining since then. And so I kind of babble as opposed to going to my notes, which I prefer. So just a couple more stories about McClellan and Stewart, because this is the Alcuin Society. And again, thank you, Alcuin Society, for all you've done for us. I mean, I think it was Brinkhurst in his book that really sort of said, you know, he counted the Alcuin Awards that we had won versus every other publishing house in Canada. And it is quite staggering. I knew we cared about that, and I'll return to them. But it was stunning, actually. So thank you, Alcuin Society. So I worked at McClellan and Stewart, and again, I stress, very young, with Frank Neufeld, whom you people know. I think Frank's been out here, he's been a judge. And my recollection, Frank, he terrified people. And apparently you think he's quite gentle. Well, he wasn't, I'll tell you, when he was at McClellan and Stewart. And we were kind of around the corner from each other in the warehouse on Hollinger Road, which had dreadful floor-to-ceiling south-facing windows, so it was about 180 degrees in the summer. But Frank was Frank. And my first memory is because McClellan and Stewart had a cafeteria in those years. It really was very simple. It met with 100 people. There were people, God knows what the salaries were, but they were practically nothing. And it was kind of a cross between a family business and a cottage industry. And my first memory, because we'd been in Yugoslavia on our honeymoon and had missed the entire 6 days war, which we heard about, in fact, from people coming back from the Middle East. And Frank spent 2 or 3 lunches in a row. His passion was reenacting the tank battles in the Sinai with salt and pepper shakers and the cutlery. And I mean, this was kind of engaging stuff for an impressionable young man. We actually got on very well, and we did quite a lot of things because he was responsible for the catalogs. And design does go up and down because as I was leaving M&S 2 years later, it was my choice, the catalog, I tried everything I could to have the catalog done on time, and it was. And we had a young designer who was newly in Toronto because of the Velvet Revolution. I mean, Toronto was full of these kinds of things were happening. And the design of the front of the cover was a very bold, curlicue 69. Never occurred to me that 69 means different things to different people. And Jack was, not to me, but he was livid. I mean, this was all deliberate. You stuck your thumb in the air at us. These were the kinds of things that were kind of, if not daily occurrences. There was that frisson of emotion and passion and craziness. And it's very hard to get that out of your blood when it's been there. And to this day, I would say, of my many flaws, being an old-fashioned publisher, if I am, in fact, of the kind of McClellan school, I would consider it a great compliment, if and when it's paid. It has been on occasion. The other story I wanted to tell about the M&S years was, in those days, everyone was starting House of Anansi. Graham Gibson, Five Legs, and Stan Bevington and Coach House. All of this was new. Coach House was a writers co-op. And at one point, because McClellan and Stewart was in financial trouble every second week, the first Christmas there in '67, we were led to believe that we wouldn't have jobs in the new year. So the kind of the angst of publishing is not new. But in all of this, the Bronfmans were going to put a very serious amount of money into McClellan and Stewart, which I think finally happened. But in all of it, M&S was going to publish Leo Culver's wife's book of poetry, Bittersweet Lemons and Love. And in those days, it was given to Stan because he was a beautiful typographer. And the decision was made to do the book beautifully and print it with lemon-scented ink. So the entire warehouse, of course, stank of lemon ink for weeks. But in all of it, Stan Bevington used to, the guys at Coach House used to have a beaver with a mortised stomach. Those of you who know heart type will know that. And in there, in the stomach, was made in Canada by mindless acid freaks. I was delegated to take the galleys, in those days there were galleys, to Leo Culver, who was now Senator Culver, the 42nd floor of the Place de la Vie at Montreal. And I'm thinking as I deliver the proofs, oh please, please no. He opens, the first thing he sees is the logo made in Canada by ASCII. He did not have a sense of humor. But those, they're anecdotes, they're nothing more than that. But there was a lot of that. And it was up and down and around. And always a crisis, but still enormous fun while it lasted. And on the author side, again, I mean, it was, and I better keep an eye on time. It was everyone from Newman to Burton. I killed a bottle of scotch once with Margaret Lawrence on the staircase in the Inn on the Park, which I have some memory of. Had a lunch with, my wife was one of the first readers of Head of a Woman, which had sat around M&S, manuscript had been lost, and I ended up, and because I was delegated to I was the PR guy, have lunch with Margaret Atwood and Peggy, I'm allowed to call her that. And this was one of those astonishingly edgy lunches where neither of us knew what to say. She was shy, I was shy, what do you say? She wasn't famous then. And at the end of it, in a desperate attempt to make conversation, she read the tarot cards. And that was the conversation over which. I mean, I see Peggy now. I mean, obviously, someone who has emerged as one of the very brightest of her time, but it's odd to remember how in a way how innocent and simple it seemed in its day. Maybe some of that is just being young. So there were stories, 100 stories, which I won't tell more. And my wife and I left. This was kind of, I think, too much too fast for us, and we decided to run off to Europe for 6 months and wander. Which we did, and I wanted to come back to the West, and Jim Douglas had said, look, if you come back, I'll guarantee you $300 a month. We don't know what that means, and I just thought you build a publishing house, you just do it. Well, it isn't quite that simple, but it seemed that simple in its day, and we came back and went from there. I think I spent some time as a bookseller, which, forgive me, I loathed. And we started selling books for other people, so that it became then, what had been Jim's company became Douglas Agencies, which became McIntyre and Stanton, which became McIntyre, Stanton and Hunt, which became Stanton and McDougall, which became Kate Walker, which became Ampersand. And that is the lineage. So the acorn spread quite far. And that was fun. I mean, I came back. That's not what I would have expected to be doing for 7 or 8 years before it actually became Douglas McIntyre. But we had to take a living from something. Jim was building the Julian bookstore chain with Harry Smith. In fact, if any of you, I don't know if anyone remembers these things, And Jim quite rightly said, you know, the chains they're gonna be here. I mean, those years it was Chapters and W.H. Smith. Well, it wasn't Chapters, it was W.H. Smith and Classics and Books a Million. I mean, there were a number of these things. And Jim's view, quite wisely, was, look, the chains are going to be here. They're going to destroy the ecology of the book business as we know it. The Duthys and the Hurtigs and all of that. Either we do a defensive move and build something here which can hold its own, or we lose. And of course, we lost, partially because the Julian Books wasn't well enough financed and the world changed, but certainly the overwhelming marauding of the chains has now, we're seeing, anyone who cares about books is seeing the net impact of that. And in its day, it expanded the market for books hugely. It changed the kind of publishing being done. It's Hollywood, where, you know, the opening weekend is all that counts. In books, you're going to get returns which average 30 to 40%. I mean, it's not a business that makes any practical sense at all, which of course bankers and anyone who knows anything about numbers understands. And it's just gotten worse. But if you're pumping out huge books, that model at a point can work. Anyway, that's the beginning. So when we started, the first books that J.J. Douglas in those days did, there were two little books, actually. One with Mort Jordan at Vancouver Public Library, the Library Press, and it was a reprint of the Wall brand, Coastnames, or BC Coastnames, still in print. And the other was a little book by a very feisty 85-year-old by the name of Nora Mannion Wilmot, which went on to sell 50,000 copies. I mean, in those years, if books would sell really quite extraordinarily. I mean, those days are so far gone, but it's kind of fun to reflect that. And of course, it's easier when you're younger. But those were our first books. And it really went from there. I'm not going to summarize everything, but I would say 2 or 3 stories about the early years. Certainly, Jim was in charge editorially, and I think the lists were really very good for what they were. They were deeply rooted in this place, because we had no money at all. We never put equity into, really serious equity into the business. So this was all done on cash flow and the goodwill of independent booksellers. And that model worked into here, it worked into certainly into the 80s. And in other places, perhaps not that long. But there were bookstores, and people cared about books in a way that people still do, by the way, I think. It's just that the broad market as a whole doesn't. But one was that you were able to do things in a very different way. And the scale was so much smaller. So we cobbled along. One story that might be worth telling is, I don't know if any of you remember, the Douglas and McIntyre, the Bull, which is our logo, and in fact still is for the Douglas and McIntyre imprint. And this had dragged on. We didn't know what to do. We were going to change the name to Douglas and McIntyre. Nobody could figure out what to do, and I think Jim and I both wanted something that was not regional, that was not Canadian necessarily, that suggested the broader world of mainstream publishing. So we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And finally, in desperation, we were having a breakfast in North Vancouver. And Jim, almost embarrassingly, said, look, he pulls out a rubbing of a 9th century Pictish bull, which Heather, his partner, had found in the museum in Edinburgh. And it was the bull. And he was almost embarrassed. He said, oh, you know, which I loved. I said, look, you're an Aries and I'm a Taurus. Bull is an animal. It's got nice lines. We excised some of them along the way to make a sleeker bull. But it was, that's how it happened. And I'm very proud of that device, which endured, still does endure, in fact, some 40 years now. So in the middle years, as I said, I think I've talked about that our modus operandi, Jim's really, from the very beginning was to be 1/3 regional, 1/3 national, 1/3 international. And I think in a very typical British Columbia fashion, we were regional and international before we were national. Because the bias of Toronto, which is actually still there, much less so now, but it took, I think, 30 years before people would stop asking me, well, do you sell your books on the other side of the Rockies? You know, there are publishers here who still think that's a sin. So it was hard to buck the trend. But publishing was going through its own kind of up and down and around with the bankruptcies and all of that. So eventually we made our way there, and we began to build a reputation nationally, which I think was pretty good. Now it is, or much better than it was. Other stories to tell, well, you know, those early years, Robert Bringhurst was someone we worked with from fairly early on. I'm trying to think of people you know. We always cared deeply about, I did, about the design and the look of the books and the production values. And so we were able to do things perhaps that in those days, Toronto publishers they weren't into graphic standards. They weren't into the book as artifact. And so we were in some respects a little bit in the direction of a private press, not really. But the production values mattered, and we worked with Jim Rimmer. Jim did all our early books. Ray Ma. I mean, there were quite a number of the designers in the town that we worked with, because this was new. This is all new territory. And the list grew apace. The University of Washington Press connection for us began with almost the first book, and Don Elligood was the publisher there then, and then it was Pat Soden. But we built, for instance, the Northwest Coast list. We built really in partnership with the University of Washington Press, when in fact the logical circumstance would have been for that partnership to be with UBC Press. But because we were out there, and I'm not sure UBC Press had barely even started then. Tony Blick was way back then. But that Northwest Coast, between my passion and the Washington list, that was an early strand of the program that has been nourished over time and still works really well. And when I think of a book, Hilary Stewart, for instance, you know, a wonderful, aged white lady, very feisty, white, no indigenous blood, did a book called Looking at Indian Art at the Northwest Coast, designed by Robert Bringhurst. Politically incorrect title, politically incorrect approach to Northwest Coast iconography. It has now sold 330,000 copies and continues to sell 6,000 copies a year in North America. You would never, ever find it in chapters. So there were those early strands of regional books, I would say illustrated books, of a commitment to First Nations that kind of defined the program, not in any deliberate way, but in a way of kind of catch as catch can. I mean, publishing is the art of the possible, and we had to make do with what we could, and some of that began to build. And the great example for me, because it was a project of mine, was The Art of Emily Carr with Dora Shadbolt, and that was a treat from beginning to end. And at the end of the day, that was 1979, and I remember sitting on the steps of Doris's their summer house on Hornby Island, talking about this. And Doris, one of the world's great ladies, who actually became one of my closest friends over time, simply did this book. Reinhard Dereth, he's not here. Reinhard Dereth designed it. We linked up with Clark Irwin because Clark Irwin had copyrights to the texts, but it sold 30,000 copies at $40 in 6 weeks in 1979. And you know, if that book was published today, it would sell 4,000 copies maybe, and it would have to be $40 or less. I mean, that was the difference in scale and passion in the book business at its end before the change in what's become a popular culture everywhere. I hope you're not bored. If you are bored, someone should say something.
No,
It's
it's good.
8 o'clock.
It's great.
I will. So in terms of sort of the later days for us, I mean, it was, I would say, from about 1980 on, because in the 70s, it was really Jim's program. And then I got there in the late 70s. And the publishing was, I think, adventuresome for its time, but in some respects tentative. Then in 1980, we entered a competition to do an elementary social studies program for the province of British Columbia called Explorations, which was transformative. I mean, it certainly hurt the trade publishing, but we won a competition that had every major educational publisher in it, but because BC bought grade-wide, however you will remember these days, it was, so we actually published an elementary social studies program from scratch, crafted around the BC curriculum that was published simultaneously, or not simultaneously, but eventually in French and English, grades 1 through 6. It was used for curriculum development in Australia. It was in every province in Canada. I mean, it was one of those extraordinary successes that catapulted us. And that was the time when our first distributor, Clark Irwin, was going bankrupt, so that it was just nip and tuck and a near-run thing. And I cannot tell you how many times serendipity / luck / government came through at the very 11th hour to save a kind of a struggling publishing house, which was the case for the industry. We were not unique in all of this. And that really characterized the 80s, because I was running the education. Jim and I kind of flipped a coin, and I was running the education part, while Jim stayed on a couple of years to run the trade side. And then we had Rick Anderson and Rob Sanders joined us it was the late 80s. But that was a kind of tumultuous time because of Clark Irwin bankruptcy, the development of public policy, and I'll come back to that. One story about what is now the Canada Book Fund that I think is worth telling because it's unexpected. But we were still in those years, and that's the middle years. So we weren't really national in the sense we became, but there's Bill Reed, Jack Shadbolt. Again, the high-end art book strand was always critical. But Bruce Hutchison, Jack Webster, Rick Hansen, Lou Mackenzie, actually at the end of that time. It was still Bruce Hutchison. I mean, it really was a time where it was a simpler time. Tom Berger, but I think we were, again, back to the idealism, giving voice to this place and ideally taking the best and most passionate voices of this place and trying to get them outside of this place with varying degrees of success. The later years I'm going to kind of just jump over, other than to say, I think from about 1995 to a couple of years ago, the company was growing. We had linked up with Forrest Rouse, which was a very happy thing. We took on Orion, and thinking we were terribly clever, until Chapters returned 75% of everything it was buying, and we were buying firm sale. It was like one rocky road after another. But Forrest Rouse was a magnificent relationship, and then by the 90s, we were licensing from Forrest Rouse. I mean, Jonathan Gillespie is one of the great publishers of his time, and I must say Roger Strauss, what a guy to encounter. And my language is contained. Roger was his preferred language turned on Anglo-Saxonisms, and you know, Ascot elegantly dressed. His mother, I guess, was a department store. He was a Guggenheim on one side, and one of the Macy's owners on the other. Stylish, superbly driven, passionate about the role of a good independent publishing house. And again, these guys are seriously charismatic, and to work with them was quite a joy. So that was a very happy relationship. And Ishmael Vale, Long Way Gone, which we licensed from them. Tom Friedman, we had a strand of that. And I think we were starting to do books that mixed a greater level of author reputation with visual component. So Douglas Copeland Bill Richardson, I have to go back to my list, Wade Davis, Will Ferguson, David Suzuki. I mean, these are all now names, and these books were doing incredibly well. I'll tell you how we got to publish How to Be a Canadian from Will Ferguson. We had a 2-book deal. It was Why I Hate Canadians was his first book. All the Toronto publishers had turned it down. It came over the transom, and Sayako Yusukawa, who was a saint and was a bedrock of us for years and years, sort of said, Scott, you really should read this. So I took it over lunch, and I read a chapter which was Why the Beaver is Appropriate as Canada's National Emblem. Well, I was on the floor, killing myself. So we made an offer for that, and we had a second book, which was to be on the Senate. But then one of those right-wing Toronto guys did a book on the Senate, one of Anna Porter's authors, whose name I forget. And it was, I remember I've been saying to Will's agent, look, that won't work. I said, but he's got a young family and he doesn't have any money. Why don't we just leave the contract open? Well, he ran into Peggy Atwood, who said, why don't you do a book called How to Be a Canadian? That's how it came to be. We did the book, it's almost 300,000 copies now. And I mean, it's a silly book in a way, but that's the joy, of course, of publishing. It's the serendipity of a mix of loyalty and standoffishness and stubbornness. And we just had a whole series of those, actually, through the 90s. Then, of course, we were confronting the next major bankruptcy, not ours, which was General Publishing and the industry with the growth and the contraction of chapters, and that the dramatic change in the ecology of the book business. Things were up and down and around, and the market was diminishing significantly and changing the kinds of things you could publish. So that was all part of things. And after the start of the General Publishing bankruptcy, and bless Sheila Cox, who I think was a very good minister, certainly good for us and good for Canada, because we invented the UNESCO Treaty on Cultural Diversity, which I won't bore you with that story here, but it's a pretty good story, which was really, it was Canada's invention, the right of nation states to make cultural policy. And we did that. It was my group and a group of guys from Quebec and France who actually pulled this off, and there's 130 nations signed into it now, in less than 7 years. But Sheila Cox was there with what was called special measures, and there was a replacement program for the receivables from Stoddard, because we were bankrupt. It was General Publishing, actually, so we were bankrupt on paper. And in those years, all through those years, my wife made me promise to say this, that the entire, I owned 65% of the company, but the entire financial risk was us. We owned it, we had nothing. The good news is I was good with banks, the bad news is I was good with banks. And we owned nothing. Our house was completely at risk. And we would have had, if the bank had called, we would have had nothing, nada, no pension, no house. So there was a point where you start to say, after 30 years, maybe it should be a little better than this. And that really led, and I always thought that you have to be big or small. There's less and less room in the middle. And that's true in film. That's true, I think, throughout the world now. And I spent, from about 2000 on, I spent 5 years trying to piece together something bigger. Abby Bennett and I talked for every year for 5 years, and then he sold a Random House. Anna Porter and I were going to put Key Porter and Douglas McIntyre together, and we had a Vancouver investor willing to do that. We tried to buy Stoddard. I mean, it was one thing after another, but they all fell apart because the equity base wasn't really sufficient to attract the scale to do something at that level. I tried to persuade Von Holtzbrinck to open a Canadian company because Canada is the only company in the English-speaking world where Von Holtzbrinck, aka Macmillan, does not have a company. And I went back and forth with John Sargent for 10 years on that. And these things don't happen. So when I had an offer from a group of Vancouver shareholders in 2007, that to buy the company, to cash out the minority shareholders. And I thought these guys had the kind of equity and were willing to invest it, that this was the platform. So that's what happened in 2007. And I was intending to go off into the sunset 2 years after that, but it didn't quite work that way, and I ended up coming back in. And depending on what you read last year, it's a relatively happy outcome in that there are now 4 new companies out of what was Douglas McIntyre. I think it would have been better to have a significant player rooted here, but there are divergent views on that. But I think the bottom line these days is publishing, for all its low return. I mean, operating margins of, I'm thinking of the business people here, operating margins of maybe 3 or 4 or 5% are good in book publishing. Well, that's pretty scary when a book publisher fronts the entire risk. All of the author advance, all of the manufacturing, all of the overhead, all the editing. So publishing has kind of been out of favor unless you get to real scale. And that, of course, is what the multinationals have done very successfully, in spite of Investment Canada, which everybody just basically hoots at. And that's okay. I think the good publishers in this country now are the multinationals, because they're run by Canadians, they're run by good people. In fact, we wanted to link up with one of them, but that didn't work out. But the good publishing, with the agents demanding more and more money, and authors have every right to expect some kind of income, the business has just dramatically transformed. Because even into the 80s and the 90s, I remember when Tony Schulte, who was then running Random New York, who was a friend, said, what should we do about Canada? And Knopf didn't exist in Canada then. I said, well, you have 2 choices. You can build Knopf Doubleday Random into the company it could be, and I desperately hope you don't do that, or you can do it, and you're nuts if you don't. And that's when Louise Dennis was hired, and and they're wonderful publishers. So it's changed the ecology so that you have the niche players and the small and the very large. And there's really less and less room in the middle. And that's not just in Canada. I've had 2 sort of major international publishers, guys I know well, in the last year, sort of say, what do you think? Can we hang in there? Can publishing survive as we know it long enough for us to get a retirement? And I've heard one of these guys is Morgan Entrican at Grove Atlantic. I mean, these are not shabby people. The other is the publisher at Albin Michel in Paris. I mean, these are really fine people. A reminder of why the business is so seductive and appealing, because they're human beings I'm honored to call friends. But everybody's kind of wondering, what do we do now? Had dinner with George Gibson in New York a couple of weeks ago. He's running Bloomsbury US. But people are saying, what's next? What does it mean? Where is the world going? And I think probably I've talked past my best due date. I'm going to have some sort of summary thoughts about where's publishing going and what does it all mean. I think the bottom line for me would be I'm enormously proud of the contribution I believe we made to the community. I think we made a difference. I think we elevated the art, architecture, and writers of this place to a level that they would never have achieved without a significant publishing house here. And I think these things will continue, but probably not at the same scale. But then that's not happening. The world is changing everywhere. So I was proud of the team we built. I think person for person, we had, in my opinion, I'm a little biased, the best team in Canadian publishing. And that was Canadian publishing, not just here. We made an impact. We had a very significant influence on public policy. From the very beginning. I was involved with everything from the BC tax credit. And I will tell one last story. Am I allowed to do that?
Yeah.
And this, again, mixes the serendipity with luck and small world. But when Canadian publishing was at one of its low ebbs and struggling like crazy in the late 70s, and the Association of Canadian Publishers was up and running, but there was no real, there was the Canada Council, But there was this whole business of the once a decade, I think it was Carl Ziegler too, once a decade there's a liquidity crisis, and people would roll their eyes. It's true, but the people would roll their eyes. And Ottawa, and these were the Liberals, Ottawa took Georges Leberge, who was a Quebec City bookseller, wonderful guy, became quite a close friend, was brought to Ottawa to see what can we do about this. And basically after some months, I mean, his conclusion, and nothing's changed since, was the only thing you can do is these guys need equity. It doesn't matter what you call it. They need equity, they're not earning it, they must have it. And that was the beginning of what became the BIPI-DIP, the Book Publishing Industry Development Program policy, and is now the Canada Book Fund. Well, they couldn't get it through Treasury Board. Things were going in circles. And at one point, it was all stalled, and people were losing heart. And because Patsy Aldana was the president of the ACP then, and Alan McDougall's father-in-law was Bob Andrus, who was head of the Treasury Board. Here it goes. And when we hired Alan and brought him out here, of course, we had dinner with his parents, and Bob and I got on really well. So Patsy said, he's in Vancouver for a long weekend. This is the last chance. If it doesn't get onto the Treasury Board agenda in the next week, it may just die. Oh, hooray. And it was a long weekend. I think it was October. We happened to, for years and years, and I haven't mentioned them, we spent New Year's with Robert Brinkhurst and Pip and Jan Elstead, Barbarian Press. I think we were there first. I think, maybe not, you might have been there first, but we were certainly one of their first patrons, still are. And the tradition was, so I've got my timing off, but we would go out there. So this must have been, this was New Year's, and spend New Year's Day there with Andrew Schroeder and Sharon Brown and Brinkhurst and all that gang. And drink too much and get very rude with each other and think we were terribly clever. But one of our closest friends, we met in Switzerland in 1969, bright, feisty, flawlessly bilingual, had become a contemplative nun and was in the Poor Clares. And their nunnery, I can't get the language right, is out there in Mission. And we always made a point of going to spend an hour there. And in the old days, you had to have a wall, a wire cage. But one of our warmest and closest friends, and all we would do, of course, is reminisce about Switzerland, because we'd spent Christmas in Switzerland, a place called the Club Vagabond, which was quite famous in its day. Well, we're there with our son, who I think 5 or 6, and she says, we'll pray for you. Come to the service. And I'm thinking, but Bob Andrus is going to phone. If I miss that call, that's the end of it. And I thought, what do we do? So I'm proud of myself. I made a moral decision. This comes first. And so we'll do this for Claire. We did. And our son was actually very quiet, which was quite good. Drove back, and my heart's in my belly. I swear, this is a true story. We walk in the house. I don't think we'd been in the house 3 minutes before the phone rang. Scott, Bob. And he said, so what is all this? And I remember the words as though they were yesterday. He said, are you crying wolf? And I said, no, we are not. And then what followed, there's various versions of this, but I've heard 2 or 3, they roughly coincide. The next week he ordered all the bureaucrats out of the room and said, do it. And that's how then, a year or 2 later, with all the machinations of Ottawa and change of government, that's how that first the business policy came to be. And obviously, a lot of other people, I mean, I'm hardly taking credit for it. It was just the serendipity of luck and being in the right place at the wrong time. And without that program, leveraged, of course, by the BC tax credit in this province, the two combined being worth something in the order of $1 million a year to McLellan, or Douglas McIntyre. I don't know what it proves, other than life is a real mix of location and luck. And I'm very proud of that story, and I thought I would tell it, and that's probably as good a way as any to end this. Thank you.
questions. So I'm going to start right here.
Hi there, my name is Vanessa Cam. I'm head of the Art, Architecture and Planning Library at UBC, and I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are on the future of art book publishing.
Well, and I've had this debate with Mark Mahay at the National Gallery. You know, I've heard all varieties of this. I think I'm a small C conservative in that the sky is never falling quite as quickly as the cynics say. And I didn't even touch on the digital revolution. I mean, I was going to go there. Books as we know them aren't going away, but books as cock of the walk are over. But art books seem to be, because people really value the artifact, art books are surviving so far better than people perhaps predicted. Because, you know, the art book was going to die with CD-ROM. Remember that? And I don't know, major international publishers blew maybe $500 million. Everyone had to have a CD-ROM publisher. Everybody raced off and hired various folk and then wrote it all off. So we were in the Alcuin bookstore in the Plaza in New York 2 weeks ago and got chatting to the woman who runs it. And Alcuin, I thought, was one of those daddy's money go up in flames. It's not. But they're doing better than ever, but they're very high end. I think there's always room. I think art books will become kind of like, to some extent, the Taschen juggernauts, that is $900. Art books, I think, they're safer than, quote, books, because, but with iPads, it's not difficult to recreate the experience of an art book. People like them on their coffee table. Now, whether this passion or whether this interest in art books will survive those of us who are now in our 60s or wherever we are, that's a real question. And I do know, I had dinner with Walter Isaacson, again, 2 weeks ago, who did the Steve Jobs biography. Very interesting guy. Aspen Institute, headed CNN at one point. In my opinion, a superb biography. And one of the things he said was, I was saying, you know, Tim Cook, what does he do now? The stock's in the tank. Steve Jobs isn't around. What's the next magic rabbit? And he said, well, you know, Steve was talking 2 or 3 things. He said, the wristwatch, which I think is silly. The magic box, the television that does everything. But what he said was, you know, and this I gather it's not in the book, that Jobs said, you know, if I cannot design an iPad that eliminates the need for textbooks, I have failed. And I think, so that's where you begin to sense the power of interactive digital. And with college texts and LI, and that's what's happened. I think Nelson's losing money. And the textbook business is just in the tank. But where does it go from there? That's a long-winded answer. I don't know, but I think art books are safe for the moment. I think the pressure is on ever more elegant, ever higher craft. But galleries want catalogs. Curators want catalogs. And that's still quite a compelling argument that is made by curators to directors. We used to get this, which is why we got Prestel to distribute us internationally, even though there weren't going to be any sales. What are you doing in Europe? That's all that curators want to know. So I think art books are okay, but like everything else, the market's shrinking. Because like Chapters couldn't sell an art book to save itself. It's sold. So you get back to ever more niche markets. Got to be international completely. And probably price up. I think we're all too timid about pricing, but that's an old hobby horse of mine. Not everyone agrees with me. But they're becoming art. I mean, it's kind of William Morris all over again. Smaller market, more focused market, perhaps focusing more on high-end craft, but not the broad market that you once had. But I don't know. All the art book publishers are sort of in trouble. Everyone's in trouble. I mean, markets are shrinking. U.S. market has diminished about 22% in the last 5 years. The other thing that people don't see is the real impact of Amazon. In the UK, art.uk.co is 30% of the Amazon, of the UK market. And until the Russian billionaire bought Waterstones and put James Daunt in there, and I got a good buddy who's on the board now, so I know quite a lot about this, that was the last white hope for anything on the high street in the UK. US is a little better, but Borders is gone. I think Len Riggio is so stubborn that he will keep Barnes & Noble working. The real question is what's going to happen when Heather gets tired of her toy, Heather Reisman. And you know, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to be unfair to her, but, you know, she's not in it for the money, it's not working all that well. I personally think the business model is very flawed. I don't think you go to Chapters to buy a barbecue when you've got Rona or Canadian Tire down the street. Chapters is buying about half as many books as they were buying 2-3 years ago, and it's going to shrink ever more. And then I know there is a cabinet document to open up the ownership policy. It's been drafted. I have a view, which I think the ownership policy served its purpose. There is a better threshold for ownership, which is to get public money. It's a fiction that the border means anything anymore. Then, if that's true, and if what the minister wanted to have happen, that seems to have kind of gone away, how long before Heather sells? I don't know. This is entire speculation. This is just me.
First of all, thank you. It's an incredibly wonderful and fascinating talk. My question is maybe the two parentheses of your career. One was when this teacher in high school came to you. Now, you mentioned that it was the farthest thing from your mind, but the teacher must have recognized something in you to offer it to you. And the second part of the question is, there's so much experience with people you've been with, and have you considered writing an autobiography, maybe with Walter Isaacson?
I have to say that I always said never, never, never. And in fact, to such an extent that we never kept very good follow-up. My wife kind of threw lots of stuff. The answer is, I'm seriously considering it. I am stunned at the number of people, including agents and quote-unquote famous writers, who said, yeah, when a Trudeau says you owe it to the country, it kind of means something. I'm going to try. I'm not convinced I can do it well enough to satisfy me. And I don't want to write negatively about people. But yeah, I'm going to have a try at this. There are people who are saying, we'll publish it. And I think now, I stun myself because the itch is growing. And I want to see. And I do enjoy writing almost as much as anything else these days. So that's, again, a long-winded answer. Yeah, I'm going to try. If I'm satisfied, we'll see.
Okay.
Wow. Do you have any anecdotes about doing cookbooks?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't, as I said, I couldn't cram everything in. I mean, we did Bidge, John Bishop, Alberto. We were kind of the first to do cookbooks of an international standard out of here. Let me think of a relevant one. Because again, Chiappino, Pinot, Mengi, Bidge, Bishop. We did pretty much all of them. The Top Table Folk. I'm trying to think of an interesting story. And I guess at one point, because Vikram and Mira, they talked to Rob, and they talked about doing a book, and I have two. And so when finally they seemed to be ready, they came to me, and we met. And Vikram is very clear views about what he wants. I want this, I want that. And Miru, who is the quintessential New Yorker, I really like these two. And Miru and to watch them fight was kind of interesting. But at the end of the first one, which was a huge success, 50,000, 60,000 copies, they did something that I don't think I've known ever another author to do. Oh, and Feeney too was us. They threw a dinner in their house. Vikram cooked for our entire staff in their house. and invited everybody, and you know, there's the famous stove, and the daughters were serving. But at one point, he stood up and made a speech, and he said, well, one of the reasons he was willing to come to us, when he was newly in the city, was working at Bishop's. And one night, Celia, Nick, and my wife and I had gone there for dinner, and he mixed up the orders, and it was lamb for beef, whatever it was, and he was terrified. He thought he was going to get fired. And he brought them out, and apparently I said, hey, that's okay, we'll eat them. And he hadn't forgotten that. I thought it was quite sweet.
Paul?
Yeah, I guess one thing I would probably disagree with you about is when you talk about the future.
No future for medium-sized firms.
Yeah.
In fact, the big guys are having to merge. You know, you've got the big six, so Random and Penguin have already announced that they have to join forces. Amazon has greater capitalization than the big six combined.
For sure.
So, you know, it's not just the little guys. But I want to come back to your notion about niche publishing. Now, you are very good friends with Andrew Steves.
Yes, because there's another story I wanted to tell.
Yeah, and we have a number of Gasbro Press books here. And I'm wondering what, you know, he's sort of proudly boutique, I think is probably how I would describe their operation. So what advice do you give Andrew now looking at the next 10 years of what's going to play out in this country? Is he doing the right thing, or is he going to have to adjust?
Well, you know, and that's why we got the Skids Group, which is a great story that I didn't tell, when everybody in Toronto thought they had it. And that bought us another year. But he and I have a back channel, and because it was Robert Bringhurst who persuaded that I would be an interesting mentor. And Cork and I, we went there, spent 3 days, and of course I like these guys. And he and I have kept an ongoing correspondence. And certainly I've said, when it came to should he have commission reps, and I said, no, that's nonsense. You don't need that stuff. But remember, it's a 2 or 3 person operation. He lives in a cabin in the woods. I mean, he has no pretensions to do anything at scale. He has great taste. He's a very good writer. He's designed a typeface. And I said this to him. I've often said, you know, he's the best young publisher in the country. If he was willing to do it, I'd have hired him in a nano-minute. But he doesn't. He hates airplanes. And he is very, very happy doing what he does. And we'll probably go see him this fall. And in fact, he's one of the people saying, look, Scott, why don't you do a riff on Frankfurt, or tell some funny stories, and I'll do a chapbook. And I may take him up on that. Great guy, and really, I stress, not only great integrity and real smarts, a sense of humor, and of course, he just, when the Toronto media were going ballistic over nobody could find Skids Group, he and I were on the phone. I mean, it was very, very funny. And at the Giller, where everybody was running around screaming that the sky was falling, it was at midnight that night that we talked. I didn't know he was going to give us the book anyway. But the sarcasm, it was wonderful to see the Toronto literary mafia just, he owes it to us. It was I was quite wicked, actually. Might have had something to do with some wine that night.
Scott, it looks like we've reached the moment. It's a splendid talk. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for asking. Thank you for being apparently good listeners.